In 2012, a man stumbled into a police station. He said he was the lost boy from 1988. The officer at the desk looked up, annoyed at first by the interruption to his quiet afternoon. Then he saw the man. Gaunt was too gentle a word. This man looked like he'd been carved out of old wood and left in the wind for a generation. His clothes, thin and ragged, hung on a frame that was barely there. His eyes, though, burned with a strange light, sunk deep in a face that had seen too much, or perhaps too little of the world they both now stood in. The officer, a young man named Peterson, felt a chill crawl up his spine. What did he mean, lost boy? From when? The man's voice was a dry rasp, like leaves skittering across concrete. He repeated himself, I'm Ethan Miller. My family, we disappeared. 1988. Peterson's mind blanked for a moment. 1988? That was 24 years ago. An eternity in police work. Cases that old were ghosts themselves, filed away in dusty boxes in the archives if they hadn't been digitized and forgotten on some server. He gestured for the man to sit, his training kicking in despite the strangeness of it all. Can you tell me more? The man, Ethan, sank onto the hard plastic chair as if his legs could no longer hold him. He clutched a bundle of something to his chest. It looked like a small, oilskin-wrapped package, old and stained. His gaze darted around the brightly lit modern office, a place of computers and clean lines, so different from wherever he'd come from. You wouldn't believe me, he whispered. People don't. Peterson leaned forward. Try me. That's what I'm here for. What made him say that? Usually, he was more reserved, more by the book. But there was something in this man's eyes, a hollow echo of immense suffering, that cut through procedure. Ethan slowly, carefully, began to unwrap his bundle. Inside, there was a small, worn, leather-bound journal, its pages yellowed and brittle, and a photograph. A faded, creased photograph of a family. A smiling man and woman, 2 young boys, and a little girl with bright ribbons in her hair. They looked happy, frozen in a moment of ordinary joy from a lifetime ago. Ethan's finger, thin and scarred, trembled as he pointed to the older boy in the picture. That's me, he said, his voice cracking. And this is my father's words. He held up the journal. He wrote it all down. Why he did it. What happened to them. Peterson felt his breath catch. The Miller family. He was too young to remember the case himself, but he'd heard whispers of it. A local legend almost. A family of 5 vanished from their home one night. No trace. No ransom. No motive anyone could ever find. It was one of those mysteries that haunted the town, a story told to scare children, a wound that never quite healed for the older generation. And now this man, claiming to be the eldest son, was sitting in front of him. Could it be true? After all these years, the details were too specific, too raw. Ethan's appearance alone was a testament to some kind of ordeal. Peterson reached for his radio, but then paused. Who would he even call? What would he say? I think a ghost just walked in? He needed more. He needed something solid. He looked at the photo, then back at Ethan's ravaged face. There was a resemblance, perhaps around the eyes, the shape of the jaw hidden beneath a wild, unkempt beard. But 24 years of hardship could change a man beyond recognition, or break him in other ways. What if he was delusional? What if this was some cruel hoax? Yet the raw pain in Ethan's voice, the sheer exhaustion radiating from him, felt undeniably real. This wasn't a performance. This was a man at the very end of his rope, finally letting go of a burden he'd carried for too long. My father, Ethan continued, his voice barely audible. He faked the break-in. He said we had to leave, that we'd be safe, he promised. But he was wrong. So wrong. He paused, A terrible silence stretching in the small room, filled only with the hum of the fluorescent lights. Peterson waited. He knew, with a certainty that settled deep in his gut, that whatever came next would change everything. The air grew heavy, thick with unspoken tragedy. "Where did you go?" Peterson asked, his own voice hushed. Ethan's eyes stared past him, seeing something far away, something cold and dark. "Alaska," he breathed. "He took us to Alaska. To die." The last word hung in the air, a chilling premonition. Peterson knew this was just the beginning. The faded photo, the worn journal, they were keys to a locked room, a story that had waited a quarter of a century to be told, and the man before him was the only one left to tell it. The quiet police station suddenly felt like the edge of a precipice. What horrors were contained in that journal? What secrets did those haunted eyes still hold? The name Miller echoed in Peterson's mind, a name tied to an unsolved mystery, a local tragedy. Now, it seemed, the mystery was walking, talking, and breathing right in front of him, bringing with it the chilling truth of a night long past. He had to know. He had to understand. He picked up a pen. "Start from the beginning," he said softly. "Tell me everything." Ethan nodded slowly, his gaze still distant, as if gathering the strength to journey back into the darkness he had somehow survived. The silence returned for a moment, pregnant with the weight of years. Then he began to speak. The year was 1988. The Miller family lived in a modest house on the edge of a small Colorado town, a place where everyone knew everyone, and secrets were hard to keep, or so people thought. Arthur Miller was a man who smiled easily but carried a weight in his eyes that few noticed. He worked a steady job at the local lumber mill, but whispers followed him, whispers of bad investments, of debts owed to the wrong kind of people. Sarah, his wife, was a kind woman, devoted to her children. Ethan, then a quiet, observant 12-year-old. Leo, a boisterous 10-year-old with a gap-toothed grin. And little Clara, only 6, the light of the family, with her laughter and endless questions. Their life, on the surface, was unremarkable. School, work, Sunday dinners. The familiar rhythms of a small-town existence. But beneath that surface, a current of unease was growing, something Ethan, even at his young age, could sense. His father was more withdrawn, his mother more anxious. Hushed arguments late at night, doors closing softly. What were they talking about? What was the shadow that seemed to fall over his father's face when he thought no one was looking? Then came the night. It was late October, the air crisp with the promise of early snow. Ethan remembered being asleep, then jerked awake by a hand over his mouth, his father's face pale and grim in the moonlight filtering through the curtains. "Shh, son. Not a word. We have to go." Now, terror, cold and sharp, pierced through Ethan's sleepiness. What was happening? He saw his mother, her face a mask of fear, gathering Leo and Clara, who were sleepy and confused. "Be quiet, my loves. Just be quiet." The house felt wrong, violated. A window in the living room was shattered, glass crunching underfoot as his father led them through the darkened rooms. It looked like a break-in, a robbery, but something felt off, even to a 12-year-old boy. It was too neat, too staged. Why would robbers leave them unharmed but force them to flee? His father didn't explain. He just kept saying, "We have to go. Trust me." They were bundled into an old, unfamiliar station wagon, parked a block away from their house, hidden in the shadows of an overgrown lane. Not their family car. Whose car was this? Where did it come from? They left with nothing but the clothes on their backs and a few hastily packed bags his father threw in the back. As the car pulled away, Ethan looked back at their small house, the only home he'd ever known, receding into the darkness. A single light burned in the kitchen, a forgotten sentinel. He never saw it again. The next morning, a neighbor noticed the silence, the Miller car still in the driveway, the newspaper still on the porch, the broken window. Panic spread through the small town like wildfire. The Millers were gone, vanished. The police arrived, cordoned off the house. An investigation began. It was meticulous, thorough. They interviewed everyone: friends, family, Arthur's colleagues at the mill. They searched the house, the surrounding woods, the nearby river. Nothing. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The initial frenzy of the search died down, replaced by a grim, persistent ache of unanswered questions. There were theories, of course. A kidnapping gone wrong. A planned escape. Some even whispered murder-suicide, though there was no evidence to support such a dark turn. Arthur's rumored debts surfaced, leading detectives down paths that led only to more dead ends. The people he supposedly owed money to denied any involvement, their faces impassive, their answers smooth. Were they telling the truth? Or was this a wall of silence, built to protect something far more sinister? The staged break-in was a focal point. It was meant to look like they were taken, but experts noted it was almost too perfect, too textbook. No fingerprints other than the family's. Nothing of real value obviously taken, just enough disarray to suggest a struggle that perhaps never happened. Who were they trying to fool? And why? The family car, still in the driveway, was another puzzle. If they'd fled, why not take their own vehicle? If they were taken, why was it left behind? Every clue seemed to contradict the last. The case grew cold. The files thickened with reports, interviews, dead-end leads. The faces of the Miller family, smiling from missing person posters, began to fade on telephone poles and in shop windows. The town moved on, as towns do. But the house remained, a silent monument to the family that had disappeared from within its walls. It was eventually sold, then sold again, but no one stayed long. Locals said it felt haunted, filled with an unbearable sadness. The story of the Millers became a cautionary tale, a piece of local folklore. What really happened that night? Did they run? Were they taken? Or did something else, something unimaginable, occur? For 24 years, there were no answers, only the silence, only the fading photographs, only the lingering question, a cold spot in the heart of the community, until Ethan Miller walked back out of the shadows, carrying the truth in his shaking hands. His voice, in that small police station room, was the first sound to break that long, terrible silence. The first thread pulled from a knot of pain and mystery. And Officer Peterson knew he was about to hear the rest of it. Ethan took a ragged breath, the effort seeming immense. The police station, with its sterile air and buzzing lights, felt a million miles away from the story he was about to tell. But Officer Peterson's quiet patience was a lifeline. He began to speak of the journey, his words painting vivid, desolate pictures in the mundane room. His father, Arthur, had been a different man that night. The usual gentle hesitation in his eyes was gone, replaced by a grim, almost frantic determination. He drove the unfamiliar station wagon with a desperate focus, his knuckles white on the steering wheel. Sarah, his mother, sat beside him, silent, her face pale and tear-streaked in the intermittent glare of passing streetlights. Then, the utter blackness of country roads. She kept looking back at them, Ethan, Leo, and Clara, huddled together in the back seat, trying to offer a reassuring smile that didn't reach her terrified eyes. Clara, too young to understand, had cried at first, asking for her teddy bear, her own bed. Leo, trying to be brave, just stared out the window, his small face tight with confusion. Ethan watched his father. He saw the sweat on his brow, despite the cool night air. He heard the way his breath hitched every time headlights appeared in the rearview mirror. Who was he so afraid of? What had he done? They drove for what felt like days, though Ethan, disoriented and exhausted, lost track of time. His father avoided main highways, sticking to winding back roads, navigating by old paper maps he'd pull out at infrequent, nervous stops in deserted areas. He bought gas with cash, his eyes constantly scanning. He bought cheap food, bread, peanut butter, canned beans, from small, out-of-the-way stores where no one would recognize them. At one point, deep in some rural stretch of country Ethan didn't recognize, his father pulled into a derelict barn. There, another vehicle was waiting. An old, battered pickup truck, with a camper shell on the back. It was even more anonymous than the station wagon. Arthur transferred their meager bags, then took a can of gasoline from the truck bed, doused the station wagon, and set it ablaze. The flames roared into the night sky, a terrifying orange beacon in the vast darkness. Ethan watched, his heart pounding, as the car that had carried them away from their lives was consumed. It felt like burning a bridge, a final, irrevocable act. "Why, Dad? Why are you doing this?" Arthur just grabbed his arm, his grip like iron. "No questions, Ethan. Just do as I say. We're almost there. Almost safe." But where was there? And what was safe? The journey in the pickup truck was even more grueling. The camper shell was cramped and cold. They slept on thin blankets, jolting over rough roads. His father drove relentlessly, stopping only for gas and necessities, pushing northward, always northward. Ethan saw the landscape change, towns becoming smaller and farther apart, forests growing denser, mountains appearing on the horizon, jagged and snow-capped even in what he guessed was now early November. His mother tried to maintain some semblance of normalcy. She'd tell them stories, quiet, made-up tales of brave knights and hidden kingdoms. But her voice was thin, and her eyes always held that flicker of fear. Leo grew quiet, his earlier attempts at bravery fading into a subdued watchfulness. Clara, resilient as children can be, would sometimes play with a button or a piece of string. Her small world shrunk to the confines of the truck bed. But even her laughter became rare. Ethan heard his parents arguing in whispers when they thought the children were asleep. Sarah's voice pleading. Arthur's, tight and defensive. "I had no choice, Sarah. It was this or worse. You have to believe me. This is for the best. A new start." But what was so bad they had to leave everything, everyone they knew? What was this worse his father spoke of? The debts, Ethan now understood from those hushed, desperate conversations, were far greater and more dangerous than he could have imagined. His father had gotten in over his head with people who didn't forgive, who didn't forget. He tried to shield his family from it, but the threat had become too real, too close. This desperate flight was his only answer, or so he believed. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity of driving, they stopped. They were in a place unlike anything Ethan had ever seen. Towering trees, a sky that seemed impossibly vast and empty. The air was bitingly cold, even though the sun shone weakly. Arthur got out of the truck and stretched, a strange expression on his face, a mixture of relief and something else, something harder to read, fear or grim satisfaction. "We're here," he announced, his voice flat. "This is it." Ethan, Leo, and Sarah climbed out, stiff and weary. Clara had to be lifted down. Before them stood a small, dilapidated log cabin, nestled deep in a thick forest of pine and birch. It looked like it hadn't been touched in decades. A plume of smoke trickled from its crooked stone chimney, the only sign of life for what felt like hundreds of miles. An old man, weathered and stoic, emerged from the cabin. He and Arthur spoke in low tones. Money exchanged hands, The old man nodded, then gestured towards the cabin and the surrounding wilderness. "It's yours," he said, then turned and walked away, disappearing into the trees without a backward glance, leaving them with the keys to an old Jeep parked nearby and a few basic supplies. This was their new home. This was the sanctuary Arthur had promised, a broken-down cabin in the middle of an Alaskan nowhere. Sarah looked at it, her face ashen. Her hand went to her mouth, stifling a sob. "Arthur, what have you done?" she whispered. He put his arm around her, his own bravado seeming to falter for a moment as he surveyed the desolate scene. "It'll be all right, Sarah. We'll make it all right. We're safe here. No one will ever find us." But Ethan looked at the dark, silent forest surrounding them, at the oppressive sky, at the crude, decaying cabin, and a cold dread filled him. Safe or trapped? The wind whispered through the trees, carrying a mournful sound, like a warning. The silence of the place was immense, broken only by the caw of a distant raven. This wasn't a new beginning. It felt like an ending. He clutched Leo's hand, feeling his younger brother tremble. Clara, sensing the adult's despair, began to cry softly. The dream of escape had led them to this. A cold, empty reality, miles from civilization, with winter already clawing at the edges of the world. Peterson listened, rapt. The man's story was so detailed, so filled with the sensory experiences of a child forced into an unimaginable situation. The fear, the confusion, the dawning horror. It was all there in Ethan's voice, in his haunted eyes. The initial days in the Alaskan wilderness were a blur of frantic activity and growing despair. Arthur, driven by a desperate energy, tried to make the cabin habitable. It was filthy, riddled with drafts, and infested with mice. There was a wood stove for heat and cooking, a few rickety pieces of furniture, and not much else. He chopped wood relentlessly, patched holes in the roof with salvaged tin, and tried to secure their meager food supplies, mostly canned goods and sacks of flour and beans they'd brought, supplemented by what the old man had left. He talked constantly of self-sufficiency, of learning to live off the land. He had books, old, worn guides to trapping, hunting, and surviving in the wild. He'd read them aloud in the evenings, his voice full of forced optimism, but his eyes betrayed his inexperience. Sarah tried her best. She cleaned, cooked what little they had, and tried to create routines for the children. She taught them lessons from memory, told them stories, sang them quiet songs. But the isolation, the constant cold, and the gnawing fear were wearing her down. Her smiles became rarer, her silences longer. Ethan watched his parents, a knot of anxiety tightening in his chest. He saw the cracks appearing in his father's confident facade. Arthur's attempts at hunting were mostly failures. He'd come back empty-handed, his face grim, after hours in the woods with the old, unreliable rifle the trapper had left. The snares he set for rabbits often remained empty. The wilderness was not the benevolent provider he'd read about in his books. It was harsh, unforgiving, indifferent to their plight. Winter arrived not as a gentle transition, but as an assault. The temperature plummeted. Snow began to fall, thick and relentless, burying the landscape under a deep white blanket, cutting them off even further from any remote chance of help, had they even known where to seek it. The wind howled around the small cabin, a constant, mournful sound that seeped into their bones. The days grew short, the nights achingly long and cold. They huddled around the wood stove, a small island of flickering warmth in a vast frozen world. Food became a constant worry. The canned goods dwindled. The flour and beans were rationed. Hunger became a familiar ache. The children suffered most. Clara, always small for her age, grew listless. Her bright laughter faded. She developed a cough, a dry, racking sound that echoed in the tiny cabin. Sarah held her constantly, trying to soothe her, her face etched with a mother's helpless anguish. She begged Arthur to do something, to take them away from this place. But where could they go? They were trapped by the snow, by their isolation, by his choices. Arthur, confronted with his daughter's worsening condition and his wife's despair, began to crumble. His forced optimism gave way to brooding silences, then to fits of rage directed at himself, at the wilderness, at the fate he'd brought upon them. He'd stare into the fire for hours, muttering to himself, his guilt a palpable presence in the small room. He started writing in the leather-bound journal Ethan now held, pouring out his remorse, his justifications, his brokenness. Ethan would see him hunched over it by candlelight, his pen scratching furiously. What secrets was he committing to those pages? What burdens was he trying to shed? Clara's cough worsened. She grew weaker, her small body struggling. Sarah nursed her with desperate tenderness, using old folk remedies, the book suggested. But nothing helped. The cold, the lack of proper food, the primitive conditions, it was too much for her small frame. One night, as a blizzard raged outside, shaking the very foundations of the cabin, Clara's breathing became shallow. Ethan, Leo, and their parents gathered around her small pallet by the stove. Sarah hummed a lullaby, her voice choked with tears. Arthur knelt beside her, his face a mask of agony, his shoulders shaking. Ethan held his little sister's hand. It was so cold. He watched the faint spark in her eyes dim, flicker, and then go out. The silence that fell in the cabin was heavier, more profound than any they had known. It was the silence of irretrievable loss. Sarah's cry was a raw, animal sound of pure grief that tore through the night. Arthur simply collapsed, his head in his hands, his body racked with sobs. Leo, terrified and uncomprehending, clung to Ethan, burying his face in his older brother's side. Ethan felt numb, a vast emptiness opening inside him. Little Clara, his bright, giggling sister, was gone, dead, because of this place, because of their father. The next day, when the storm had passed, Arthur, his face gray and lifeless, dug a small grave in the frozen ground, a short distance from the cabin, beneath a tall pine tree. He wrapped Clara's tiny body in their best blanket. There were no prayers, no ceremony, just the harsh sound of the shovel hitting the icy earth, and Sarah's silent, unending tears. After they had covered the small mound with stones to keep animals away, Arthur went back into the cabin and wrote in his journal for hours. Ethan saw the words, later. It was my fault, all my fault. I killed my little girl. The first entry in a litany of guilt. That first Alaskan winter had claimed its first victim. The family, already fractured by fear and flight, was now broken by grief. The dream of a new life had become a nightmare, from which there seemed no escape. The cabin, once a flimsy promise of sanctuary, now felt like a tomb, and the wilderness outside, beautiful in its starkness, was a silent, waiting predator. The cold wasn't just in the air anymore. It was in their hearts. The death of Clara was a wound from which the Miller family, or what was left of it, would never recover. It was like a vital thread had been snipped, and everything else began to unravel. Sarah, who had fought so hard to maintain a semblance of hope, sank into a profound, silent despair. She moved like a ghost through the small cabin, her eyes empty, her voice barely a whisper. She rarely spoke to Arthur, and when she did, her words were laced with a quiet, bitter accusation that was more devastating than any shouted rage. "You brought us here to die," she'd say, her voice flat, devoid of emotion. And he had no answer. He knew she was right. His guilt was a heavy shroud he wore constantly. He stopped trying to hunt or forage with any real conviction. He spent most of his days staring into the fire or scribbling furiously in his journal, adding to his confession, his testament of failure. The entries became more erratic, filled with self-loathing and a yearning for an forgiveness he knew he would never receive. He wrote about the debts, the threats, the desperate gamble he'd taken, believing he could outrun his past and build a new future. Now he saw only the devastating cost of that gamble. Leo, who had idolized his father and adored his little sister, withdrew into himself. He stopped playing, stopped asking questions. He'd sit for hours by the small, frosty window, staring out at the endless snow, his thin shoulders hunched. He missed Clara terribly. He started coughing, a dry, persistent cough, just like Clara's had been at first. Sarah's attention, listless as it was, focused on Leo with a renewed, desperate intensity. She couldn't lose another child. She couldn't. She nursed him as best she could with their dwindling supplies and her own fading strength. Ethan, now 13, felt the weight of the world on his young shoulders. He tried to be strong for his mother, for Leo. He took over many of his father's tasks, chopping wood, checking the mostly empty snares, trying to make their meager rations last. He was becoming a man too quickly, hardened by loss and the brutal realities of their existence. He learned to read the subtle signs of the wilderness, the way the wind shifted, the tracks of animals in the snow. He learned to be quiet, to observe, to endure, but inside he was a tangle of grief, anger, and a growing, terrifying sense of isolation. He missed his sister with an ache that never faded. He worried constantly about Leo, and he felt a confusing mix of pity and resentment towards his father, the man who had brought them to this desolate end. The second winter approached, and with it, a renewed sense of dread. Their supplies were critically low. Arthur made a few half-hearted attempts to journey to the nearest vague point of civilization. A trading post the old trapper had mentioned was a week's walk away, but he was too weak, too broken. He always turned back after a day or two, defeated. Leo's condition worsened steadily. He was thin, pale, his cough almost constant. He had no strength left to fight. Sarah held him, rocked him, sang to him, her face a mask of sorrow. Ethan knew, with a chilling certainty, what was coming. One bleak afternoon, as the first heavy snows of their second Alaskan winter began to fall, Leo stopped breathing. He died quietly, in Sarah's arms, his eyes fixed on Ethan, a silent farewell. There was no outcry this time, just a heavy, suffocating silence. Sarah held Leo's small, still body for hours, her tears falling silently onto his face. Arthur sat by the stove, his head bowed, a broken man. Ethan felt a cold rage build inside him, a rage against his father, against the relentless cruelty of this place. Two of them gone. Later, Arthur and Ethan dug another grave, next to Clara's, under the same tall pine. The ground was harder now, frozen solid. It took them hours. Arthur moved like an automaton, his face devoid of expression. As they laid Leo to rest, a wolf howled in the distance, a long, mournful cry that seemed to echo the desolation in their hearts. Arthur returned to the cabin and wrote in his journal, "Leo too, my boy, my fault. Sarah won't look at me. I don't blame her. There is nothing left." The cabin became a mausoleum, haunted by the ghosts of their lost children. The silence was broken only by Sarah's soft weeping or Arthur's occasional muttered words of self-recrimination. Ethan retreated further into himself, his only companions, the wind and the trees, and the ever-present ache of loss. He learned to hunt with a desperate focus, driven by the need to keep himself and his mother alive, though she seemed to have no will left to live. He became adept with the snares, occasionally catching a rabbit or a ptarmigan. He learned to fish through the ice in a nearby frozen creek. These small successes were all that stood between them and starvation. He was no longer a boy. He was a survivor, forged in the crucible of unimaginable hardship. But what was he surviving for? The hope that had once flickered faintly within him was almost extinguished, buried under layers of grief and the crushing weight of their isolation. The wilderness had taken his sister, then his brother. He looked at his parents, shells of their former selves, and wondered who would be next. The question hung in the frigid air, unspoken but understood. The death of Leo seemed to drain the last vestiges of spirit from Sarah Miller. She had lost both her younger children to the relentless Alaskan wilderness, to the consequences of her husband's desperate choices. There was nothing left for her to fight for, or so it seemed. She stopped eating, mostly. Just a few bites to appease Ethan when he would plead with her, his young face etched with worry. She spent her days lying on her pallet, staring at the rough log ceiling, or sometimes, when she had the strength, she would sit by the window, looking out at the two small, stone-covered mounds under the pine tree. Her vibrant energy, her warmth, the very essence of who she was, had been leached away by grief and deprivation. She was fading, like an old photograph, exposed to too much harsh light. Arthur, already broken, retreated further into the dark labyrinth of his guilt. He barely spoke. His journal became his only confidant. His entries, Ethan would later read, were increasingly fragmented, despairing. He wrote of Sarah's decline, blaming himself. He wrote of his lost children, their faces haunting his waking hours and his tormented dreams. He wrote of the crushing loneliness, even with his wife and son still there, because he knew he had become a stranger to them, a monster in their eyes, and in his own. Ethan, now a gaunt but hardened 15-year-old, shouldered the burden of their survival alone. He hunted, trapped, fished, chopped wood. He was the only thing keeping them from succumbing completely. He would try to talk to his mother, to coax her to eat, to walk a little outside when the weather permitted. Sometimes she would respond with a faint smile, a touch of her cold hand, but her eyes remained distant, lost in a place he couldn't reach. He rarely spoke to his father. What was there to say? Blame was a useless currency in their frozen world. Survival was all that mattered, a grim, day-to-day struggle. One morning, Sarah didn't wake up. Ethan found her still and cold, a peaceful expression on her face, as if she had finally found release from her suffering. There was no shock, no surprise, just a profound, weary sadness. He had known, somehow, that this was inevitable. Arthur reacted with a strange calmness, a chilling acceptance. He helped Ethan carry Sarah's frail body outside. They made a third grave next to Leo and Clara, 3 graves under the tall pine tree, a family plot in the heart of the wilderness. As they stood there, the wind sighing through the branches, Arthur turned to Ethan, his eyes, for the first time in a long while, holding a flicker of something other than despair. It looked like a desperate plea. He reached into his worn coat and pulled out the leather-bound journal. He pressed it into Ethan's hands. "This," he said, his voice raspy, barely a whisper. "This is the truth. What I did. Why? Someday, if you ever get out of this accursed place, you tell them. Tell them what happened. Don't let me be just a monster. Let them know I loved you all. I loved you all so much." His hand lingered on Ethan's arm for a moment, a fleeting, desperate connection. Then he turned and walked away from the cabin, heading into the dense, snow-laden forest without a backward glance. Ethan called after him, "Dad, where are you going?" But Arthur didn't stop. He just kept walking, a solitary, broken figure, disappearing into the vast, indifferent whiteness. Ethan waited. He thought his father would return when the cold bit too hard, or when hunger gnawed. But hours passed, and then a day. A light snow began to fall, covering Arthur's tracks. Ethan knew with a certainty that settled like ice in his stomach that his father wasn't coming back. He had chosen his own end. After 2 days, Ethan went looking for him. He followed the faint trail as best he could, calling out his father's name, his voice swallowed by the immense silence of the forest. He found Arthur a mile from the cabin, slumped at the base of a large spruce tree, frozen solid. His eyes were closed, his face peaceful, almost serene, dusted with a fine layer of snow. He looked like he was merely sleeping, but Ethan knew better. He had walked out into the wilderness to meet his fate, perhaps seeking a final, cold absolution. Ethan dragged his father's body back to the cabin. It was a Herculean task for his thin frame, but he did it. He couldn't leave him out there for the wolves. He dug a 4th grave, beside Sarah's. The last grave. His hands were raw and bleeding by the time he was done. He said no words. There were no tears left, just a hollow emptiness. He was alone, utterly, completely alone. The sole survivor of the Miller family, marooned in the heart of the Alaskan wilderness, with the ghosts of his parents and siblings his only companions. He went back into the silent cabin, the journal clutched in his hand. The fire in the stove had almost died. He added more wood, the flames slowly rekindling, a small spark of life in the overwhelming desolation. He was 15 years old, and the world as he knew it had ended. How long could he survive? Did he even want to? The wind howled outside, a lament for the lost. The journal felt heavy in his hands, a testament to a tragedy he was now the sole guardian of. Night fell, vast and star-strewn, the aurora borealis dancing faintly in the northern sky, a silent, beautiful witness to his solitude. The years that followed were a blur of seasons, a relentless cycle of survival fought in the deepest solitude imaginable. Ethan Miller, no longer a boy, not yet fully a man in the eyes of the world he'd left behind, became a creature of the wilderness. He learned its rhythms, its dangers, its sparse generosities. He had to. There was no other choice but to learn or to die. The cabin, filled with the ghosts of his family, became his sanctuary and his prison. He talked to them sometimes, his voice hoarse from disuse. He'd tell Clara about a bird he'd seen, or ask Leo's imagined advice on a trap. He'd read passages from his father's journal aloud to his mother, as if seeking her understanding, her forgiveness on Arthur's behalf. His father's journal was his only link to the past, his only company besides the memories. He read it over and over, the ink fading, the pages brittle. He came to understand the desperation that had driven his father, the fear of creditors, the shame of failure. It didn't excuse what Arthur had done, the devastation he'd wrought, but it added layers of complexity to the monster Ethan had sometimes thought him to be. He saw his father as a flawed, broken man who had made a catastrophic mistake, a gamble that cost him everything. He learned to hunt with a quiet skill, moving through the forest like a shadow. He learned which plants were edible, which were poison. He learned to mend his own clothes, to make tools from scraps of metal and bone. He learned to endure the crushing loneliness, the long dark winters where the sun was a distant memory. Time lost its meaning. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months, months into years. He marked the passing of seasons by the migration of birds, the freezing and thawing of the creek, the changing colors of the sparse vegetation. He rarely saw another human being. Once, a small plane flew high overhead, a distant silver speck. He watched it until it disappeared. A pang of longing, sharp and painful, piercing his solitude. But what would he do if he encountered someone? What would he say? Who was he now? He was a wild thing, more animal than human in some ways, yet still clinging to the tattered remnants of his former life, his former self. Through the words in his father's journal and the faded photograph of a smiling family he kept wrapped with it, he grew gaunt, his body hardened by labor and scarcity, his face weathered by sun and wind and cold. His eyes, though, held a strange intensity, the look of someone who has stared into the abyss and somehow, inexplicably, survived. What kept him going? Perhaps it was the promise he'd made to his father, to tell their story. Perhaps it was some primal instinct to live, to endure, despite everything. Or perhaps it was simply that he didn't know how to stop, how to give up. He had forgotten how to be anything other than a survivor. Then, one spring, nearly a decade after his father's death, something shifted within him. He was tracking a moose deeper into the wilderness than he usually ventured. He came to a high ridge and looked out. In the far, far distance, almost invisible on the horizon, he saw a faint, unnatural glimmer, a flicker of light. It could have been anything, a reflection, his imagination, but it ignited something in him, a spark of curiosity, a whisper of a world beyond his frozen prison. For weeks, the image of that distant light haunted him, the world outside, civilization, people. The thought was both terrifying and alluring. He was in his late 20s now, by his rough calculation. He had spent more of his life in this wilderness than out of it. Could he even function in that other world anymore? Did he want to? But the journal weighed heavily in his small pack. His father's last wish, his family's story. It needed to be told. The burden of silence had become too great to bear. The decision, when it finally came, was less a conscious choice and more a surrender to a deep, undeniable need. He had to go back. He had to try. He packed his few meager belongings, the journal, the photograph, a knife he'd fashioned, some dried meat, his tattered furs. He looked at the 4 graves under the pine tree one last time, a silent farewell. Then he turned his back on the cabin, on the only home he'd known for most of his life, and started walking south, towards that distant, imagined glimmer of light. The journey out was an ordeal in itself. He was weak from years of malnutrition, unused to sustain travel over such vast distances. He crossed swollen rivers, navigated treacherous mountain passes, endured days of hunger when his supplies ran out. But he kept going, driven by a purpose he hadn't felt in years. After weeks of walking, ragged, exhausted, and on the brink of collapse, he stumbled upon a remote logging road. He followed it for 2 more days until finally he saw a truck. A real truck with a real person driving it. The logger, a rough, kind man, stared at Ethan in stunned disbelief, this wild apparition emerging from the deep woods. He gave Ethan food, water, and eventually a ride to the nearest small town. That town was a shock to Ethan's system. The noise, the lights, the sheer number of people. It was overwhelming, alien. He was a ghost from another time, another world. He had a little money, coins his father had hoarded, useless for years, now a means to buy a bus ticket. He didn't know where he was going, just south. Away from the cold, away from the past. He ended up in Colorado, the state where his journey into darkness had begun. He didn't consciously choose it. It was as if some homing instinct, deep and buried, had led him back to his origins. And then he found himself standing outside a police station. His heart pounded. This was it. The moment he had carried in his mind for so many years. He clutched the oilskin packet containing the journal and the photograph. He took a deep breath, the air of this new, strange world feeling thin in his lungs, and walked inside. Officer Peterson looked up. The story Ethan had told him, the journey from that faked break-in to this police station, was almost complete. The DNA test. Peterson had insisted on it. Gently. Ethan had agreed. Passively. He knew who he was. The results came back a few days later. A perfect match to the trace DNA they still had on file from Ethan Miller, age 12, recovered from his old bedroom in 1988. It was him. The lost boy had come home, or at least what was left of him. The confirmation of Ethan Miller's identity sent ripples through the small Colorado Police Department, and soon, far beyond. A case that had been dormant for 24 years, a local tragedy that had faded into a sad legend, was suddenly, shockingly alive. Detectives, older now, some retired, who had worked the original Miller disappearance were called in. They listened to Ethan's story, read copies of Arthur Miller's journal, their faces a mixture of disbelief, sorrow, and a strange kind of professional vindication. The mystery that had haunted them for decades finally had an answer, albeit a horrifying one. The first step was to corroborate Ethan's incredible tale. Arthur Miller's journal was scrutinized. Handwriting experts compared the script to old signatures and documents from 1988. It was a match. The detailed entries, filled with names, dates, and specific emotional confessions, painted a damning portrait of a man crumbling under guilt. Financial records from the late 1980s were unearthed. Arthur Miller had indeed been in serious debt, far more than anyone had publicly known. There were records of loans from shady lenders, defaults, and what looked like desperate attempts to secure more funds just before the family vanished. The motive Ethan described, his father faking a break-in to escape these crushing debts and start a new life, suddenly seemed chillingly plausible. Then there was the Alaskan part of the story. Could they find the cabin? The graves. Alaska was vast, much of it unmapped wilderness. Ethan's descriptions were based on a child's memory, then a young man's isolated existence. He knew landmarks by his own names, the Twin Peaks, the winding river, the tall pine that marked his family's resting place. But translating that into coordinates on a map was almost impossible. Search teams, using Ethan's recollections and satellite imagery, made several attempts to locate the area he described. They flew over remote valleys, followed unnamed rivers. But the Alaskan wilderness guarded its secrets well. After weeks of searching, with winter again approaching in those northern latitudes, the official search for the cabin and the graves was reluctantly called off. The wilderness was too vast. The chances of finding such a small, isolated spot after so many years, too slim. The final resting place of Sarah, Leo, Clara, and Arthur Miller would remain known only to Ethan and to the silent, watching trees. What about the original Miller house in Colorado? It was still standing, though it had passed through several owners, none of whom had stayed long. It was currently vacant, a little neglected, but structurally sound. The police arranged for Ethan to visit it, thinking it might trigger more memories, or perhaps offer some sense of closure. Ethan agreed, though hesitantly. Walking through those rooms again, rooms he had last seen as a 12-year-old boy on the terrifying night they fled, was a surreal experience. The layout was the same, but everything felt smaller, different. The faint scent of his mother's baking was long gone, replaced by the musty smell of disuse. He stood in his old bedroom, touching the faint scratches on the windowsill where he used to line up his toy soldiers. He saw the ghosts of his family everywhere. His mother in the kitchen, his father in his armchair, Leo and Clara laughing as they ran down the hallway. The memories were so vivid, so painful, they were almost unbearable. He didn't stay long. There was no closure to be found there, only more sorrow. The world, through the relentless lens of the media, soon learned of Ethan Miller's return and the tragic fate of his family. His story was sensational, a tale of desperation, survival, and unimaginable loss. There were headlines, interviews, though Ethan gave very few, shielded by the police and a lawyer appointed to help him, and endless speculation. Some people expressed immense sympathy for Ethan, marveling at his resilience. Others focused their anger on Arthur Miller, condemning him for the choices that led to his family's destruction. There were those, too, who whispered doubts, finding the story too incredible, too much like a dark fairy tale. But the DNA evidence was irrefutable. The journal was damning. And Ethan's haunted eyes told a story that no skeptic could easily dismiss. The case of the vanished Miller family was officially closed. The how and why were known. But for Ethan, the journey was far from over. The truth was out, but the weight of his past, the years of solitude and loss, remained. He was a man out of time, a stranger in a world that had moved on without him. He had survived the wilderness, but could he survive this new, bewildering world of people, expectations, and the suffocating sympathy of strangers? The police psychologist who worked with him described him as remarkably resilient but deeply traumatized, carrying scars that would likely never fully heal. The future was a vast, terrifying, unknown, much like the Alaskan wilderness had once been. But this time, he wasn't entirely alone. Or was he? The glare of the world's attention eventually faded, as it always does. The news cycle moved on to other tragedies, other marvels. Ethan Miller, the boy who returned from the dead, was left to pick up the pieces of a life he never asked for. In a world he no longer understood, what becomes of a man who has lived such a life? He had no education beyond what his mother had taught him in the early days and what he'd gleaned from his father's few books. He had no skills suited to this modern society, only the hard-earned knowledge of how to survive in a frozen wasteland. He had no family, no friends. The distant relatives the police managed to track down were strangers, curious and perhaps a little fearful of this man who carried such a dark story. They offered awkward condolences, a handshake, but no real connection. He was a living ghost, a testament to a past they had only read about. The small amount of money from a victim's compensation fund and some donations from sympathetic strangers gave him a temporary buffer. He found a small, quiet apartment in an anonymous town, far from the place where his family had vanished, far from the prying eyes of the media. He tried to build a life, or at least the semblance of one. He got a simple job, manual labor that didn't require much interaction. He learned to navigate grocery stores, to use a cell phone, to understand the bewildering pace of modern life. But it all felt unreal, like he was watching himself from a great distance. The nights were the hardest. In the silence of his small room, the ghosts of his past were his most constant companions. He would see Clara's smile, hear Leo's laugh, feel his mother's gentle touch, see his father's haunted eyes. The memories were a part of him, etched into his very being. He couldn't escape them, nor did he entirely want to. They were all he had left of his family. He rarely spoke of his experiences. Who could possibly understand? He carried his father's journal with him, still. Sometimes he would read it, not for the story anymore, but for the familiar cadence of his father's handwriting, a tangible link to a life that felt like a dream or a nightmare. He often thought of Alaska, of the cabin, the graves under the tall pine. He knew he would probably never see them again. Part of him yearned for the stark simplicity of that life, despite its horrors. There, at least, things had been clear. Survive. Endure. Here, in this world of endless choices and confusing social codes, he felt adrift. There was no real resolution to his story, no neat ending. The truth was out, but the pain remained, a dull ache in his soul, He had survived, yes, but to what end? He was a living monument to loss, a reminder of a father's tragic mistake. His catharsis, if it could be called that, was quiet, internal. It was in the telling of his story, the unburdening of that terrible secret he had carried for so long. It was in the knowledge that his family, though lost, was not entirely forgotten. Their story was known. Perhaps that was a form of peace. One cool autumn evening, years after his return, Ethan found himself driving through the small Colorado town where his childhood home still stood. He hadn't planned it. He just drove. He parked down the street, just as his father had parked that unfamiliar station wagon all those years ago. He looked at the house. Lights glowed in the windows. A new family lived there now, their lives untouched by the tragedy that had unfolded within those walls so long ago. He saw the silhouette of a child at an upstairs window, perhaps in what used to be his room. He watched for a long time, a solitary figure in the deepening twilight. There was a bittersweet pang in his chest, a mixture of profound sadness and a strange, detached acceptance. His family was gone. Their life together was a shattered memory. But life, in its relentless way, continued. He started the car and drove away, not looking back. He carried his ghosts with him, not as a crushing burden anymore, but as a quiet, constant presence. They were part of who he was. The lost boy, now a man, still searching for his place in a world that had moved on, forever marked by the silence of the snow and the enduring power of a story that had finally been told. Have you ever heard of anything like this? Share your thoughts or stories in the comments.